A coalition of rights organizations has taken out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times against the new farm laws in India. This advertisement alleges that the government has responded to peaceful protests with tear gas and water cannons. It claims that the new laws benefit corporations and remove protections for farmers. Now, this advertisement sets a dangerous precedent. For starters, the New York Times is an American publication. Most of its readers are in the West. Such an advertisement can serve only one purpose: to create a biased perception of a law that does not affect them. The farm laws were created by elected representatives of India, passed by the Parliament of India. By publishing ads against the legislation, these groups are trying to internationalize the issue. In other words, infringing on the sovereign duties of the Indian Parliament. The other issue to note here is funding. The Times is one of the leading newspapers in the world, not to mention one of the most widely read. Taking out a full-page ad costs around $250,000 That's almost 1.8 crore rupees. A clear indication that there are affluent vested interests supporting such campaigns from behind the scenes. Now, 70 rights organizations are a part of this coalition. It is an overwhelmingly Western initiative with little to no representation from India. One of the signatories is Hindus for Human Rights, an advocacy group based in America. Another is Global Projects Against Hate and Extremism. They deal mostly with North America and Europe. And then there is the New York City Fair Trade Coalition. As the name suggests, they are advocates of free trade. Another name that stands out is Win Without War. It was formed in 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War. The question that arises is, why is an American anti-war coalition wading into a protest taking place thousands of miles away? This ad is the latest salvo in what is becoming a battle to control the narrative. If the idea was to support the farmers, it would have made sense to publish an ad in Indian newspapers. But here, the target audience is not India. This is not an indictment against the protest. In fact, the Indian government has welcomed the need for peaceful protest and dialogue. But this advertisement goes beyond that. It is not just supporting the protest. It is calling for the cancellation of a law drafted by India's parliament. Joining us on the broadcast this minute is our correspondent Susan Tehrani from New York. Hi, Susan. First up, tell us, how often do you find such ads with a domestic issue at its core, thousands of miles away, in an esteemed and renowned publication like the NYT, and what purpose can it serve?
You know, Molly, this is part of a wider conversation about journalism, activism, and profit. And as many expert and media analysts have noted, there is a very fine line between these three, notably journalism and activism. And to adhere to journalistic integrity, these need to be separated. We don't see this right now in this case. And one of the outcomes of really putting these two together is that people will start to lose trust in the media, as we have seen in recent years, because so many of these incidents has happened. You know, in this woke culture that we have recently seen, because these lines become murky, then the question arises about whether or not this is for profit, for activism, or is it providing journalistic reporting for the audience. And another significant point is, while the reader is extremely savvy, by coming out and paying for an ad like this on the A section of a paper like the New York Times, which, as you noted, is extremely expensive, it's one of the first sections of the paper, you run a front page ad, it reads and looks like a newspaper headline. And that may be manipulating to the reader at first glance on whether or not this is a paid advertisement or if it's a journalistic news story that has been endorsed by the New York Times. And when the New York Times comes out and runs this ad, it's on the one hand, putting itself somewhat away from the story, not endorsing it 150% completely or 100% by running an article by one of its journalists, but it's still giving the space for profit for such an ad to run. Wondering what kind of precedent this sets at a time when we're always critical of outside interference and the role of money in, for example, politics and elections. Then what role does the media play in this regard? And I think looking at this objectively, this is one instance, but it can be a precedent for a bigger problem, and some that we're facing right now.
Right. Susan, tell us more about this coalition. It's an American anti-war coalition which is put out this advertisement. And as we discussed, and as you mentioned once again, that it's not easy monetarily to get this space for anyone who wishes to advertise. It costs a heavy sum, as we just mentioned, and these are affluent groups then that are funding this advertisement.
Yeah, when you look down the list, a lot of these coalitions who have been supporting this ad were probably not as credible as one might have thought a few years ago. But then again, you know, we really have a climate that's moving so much to the left and is promoting progressive ideals. Some might even call these anti-war coalitions as being somewhat leftist or socialist organizations. And when you see that they're, you know, coming out with these ads, it really shows the climate that these organizations and these groups are now willing and able to thrive, whereas a few years ago they really wouldn't have a space at a paper called the New York Times, labeling itself as a newspaper of records. As you rightly mentioned, it is very expensive to get an ad like this on the one hand, raising the question, as we talked about, on the intersection between activism and profit and journalism. But on the other hand, while the New York Times profits from this organization and these organizations that are often very marginalized get an opportunity to have a say in the newspaper of records where they had it before. So it's a win-win situation for them, those two sides, but it leaves the viewer sort of concerned and the reader wondering whether or not they're really reading an unbiased paper and where all this stands. I will tell you, if you ask any journalist, they will tell you that they're always looking for the best accurate story that will come out. And if I had to make a guess, my guess would be that this letter was circulated to different news organizations and no one picked it up. And as a last-ditch resort, they came out and paid money and put it out as an ad. It's very unlikely that when a news story comes out, the creators of the news, their first option would be to run their message as a quote-unquote ad. It's usually used as a last resort, which again raises the question, how much standing do ads like these really have, and are they really able to sway public opinion, even if journalistic activism is a powerful tool. So a lot goes into this one paper and one ad, and it can really have wider implications about the freedom of speech and those who perhaps will be suppressed because they don't have the money to run ads like this.
Susan Tehrani, thanks very much for joining us with those updates and perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.